America has built some of the most iconic cars in history, but it also produced vehicles so catastrophically bad, so poorly engineered, and so hilariously ugly that they make you question how they ever left the factory. These are the top 10 ultra worst. Cars that should have been buried, banned, or forgotten, yet somehow existed.
Please support us and subscribe to the channel. Thank you.
Number 10. 1973 Buick Century base sedan. The rolling sofa that mistook itself for a car. The 1973 Buick Century base sedan is one of those cars that perfectly captures the strange and confused energy of early 70s American automobiles. It was huge, heavy, slow, soft, and vaguely depressing in motion, yet it tried very hard to pretend it was something refined. Buick marketed it as a modern, stylish, mid-size family sedan. In reality, driving a 73 Century base model felt less like driving a car and more like trying to steer an overstuffed sofa that someone had strapped to a pair of roller skates. To start, the car's sheer size didn't help its case. Even though Buick called it mid-size, a phrase that only makes sense in 1970s Detroit, the 1973 Century was enormous by any normal standard. The doors were heavy, the hood was so long it could have served as a landing strip for small aircraft, and the trunk could store a month's worth of groceries plus the family dog. But despite its imposing footprint, it wasn't intimidating. It was sleepy. Everything about its shape looked like it was slowly melting, from the rounded roofline to the tail drooping. This was not a car that wanted to go fast. This was a car that wanted to lie down. Under the hood, the base Century came with one of the most uninspiring engine options Buick ever produced. A wheezy 350 cubic inch V8 that somehow managed to feel both large and powerless. Thanks to emissions regulations, low compression ratios, and detuned carburation, this once proud V8 now had the fighting spirit of a tired vacuum cleaner. Acceleration was a generous term. Gradually picking up speed is more accurate. If you floored it, the engine groaned like an old man getting up from a couch. The transmission hesitated, and the cart lumbered forward with all the urgency of a sleepy buffalo. The steering was another unforgettable experience, but not in a good way. Buick's power steering in 1973 was tuned for one thing and one thing only: effortless softness. You could spin the wheel with your pinky finger, but you had absolutely no idea what the front wheels were actually doing. Steering inputs felt disconnected from reality. You turn the wheel, and several seconds later, the Century would begin drifting in the vague direction you requested. It was like trying to pilot a mattress sliding across a polished floor. But nothing beats the suspension. The Century suspension was the automotive equivalent of marshmallows, soft, squishy, and ready to collapse under pressure. Of course, Buick called it cushion comfort, and to be fair, the car did ride like a cloud. Unfortunately, it also handled like one. The car wallowed dramatically around corners, heaved forward on the braking, and squatted when accelerating. All movements exaggerated, like a boat in choppy water. If you took a corner at anything above school zone speed, you could feel the entire body leaning like it was trying to escape its own chassis. Passengers could practically get seasick. Inside, the base Century was equally uninspiring. Buick knew how to build plush interiors, but the base sedan was more budget motel lobby than luxury lounge. Vinyl seats that stuck to your skin in summer, thin door panels, and a dashboard that seemed assembled from leftover plastic all contributed to its underwhelming vibe. Yet the seats remained incredibly soft. Too soft. You didn't sit in them. You sank into them like a beanbag. Combine this with the marshmallow suspension, and you got the full experience of trying to drive a sofa while sitting inside another sofa. Fuel economy was another cruel joke. The base Century drank gasoline like a thirsty elephant, especially when lugging around its oversized body with its underpowered V8. In an era of increasing fuel prices and looming emission standards, the Century base sedan was shockingly inefficient, even by 70 standards. You could practically watch the fuel gauge move downward on long highway trips. Yet people still bought them. Buick's reputation for comfort, reliability, and premium feel worked wonders on the average American family. They didn't want excitement. They wanted softness, quietness, and the feeling that their car would never challenge them. And the 1973 Century absolutely delivered on that. It never challenged anyone. It barely even responded to them. It simply existed, large, soft, and endlessly agreeable. Today, the 1973 Buick Century base sedan is mostly forgotten, overshadowed by more interesting Buicks and more memorable disasters from the decade. It isn't rare, it isn't collectible, and it certainly isn't admired for its performance. But it is a perfect time capsule, a reminder of the moment when American cars became bigger, softer, slower, and far less engaging. A moment when comfort mattered more than connection, when style was vague and speed was optional. Ultimately, the 73 Century stands as a rolling symbol of early 70s complacency. It wasn't built to thrill. It wasn't built to handle. It wasn't even built to be particularly efficient. It was built for one thing: to give its driver the illusion of comfort while floating down the road like a sofa on roller skates. And in that sense, the Century succeeded, spectacularly, hilariously, and unmistakably.
Number 9. 1974 Oldsmobile Omega. The X-body fail that Oldsmobile wishes you'd forget. The 1974 Oldsmobile Omega is one of those cars that sounds respectable on paper, but collapses into a comedy of mechanical errors the moment you actually examine it. Introduced as Oldsmobile's entry-level compact, the Omega was nothing more than a rebadged Chevrolet Nova, an attempt to give a cheap X-body platform a fake sense of dignity by slapping on Oldsmobile badges and slightly nicer trim. Unfortunately for Oldsmobile, no amount of chrome, script logos, or sales brochure poetry could hide the fact that the Omega was a disaster disguised as a car. Let's start with the most infamous aspect of the 1974 Omega: its relentless stalling problems. The X-body platform was notorious for this. If you idled too long at a red light, the engine would cough, shudder, and occasionally decide it didn't want to participate in life anymore. Drivers grew accustomed to shifting into neutral, one foot hovering over the accelerator, praying the car wouldn't stall in the middle of a busy intersection. At stop signs, Omega owners played a daily game of, will the engine quit this time? It was a car that constantly tested its driver's faith. Electrical issues? The Omega had them in spades. The wiring harness was so poorly routed and cheaply insulated that shorts and failures were practically guaranteed. Turn on the headlights and your dashboard lights might flicker. Honk the horn and the radio could cut out. Try to use the heater fan and something under the dash might start smoking. The Omega didn't have a reputation for electrical meltdowns. It had a career built on them. Even new owners found themselves making an unplanned early acquaintance with their local mechanic. Then there was the interior, a masterpiece of disappointment. While Oldsmobile ads bragged about refined appointments, the truth was that the Omega's cabin felt like it was assembled from leftover materials found in a clearance bin. Thin plastic panels rattled, fake wood trim peeled and bubbled, seats sagged after a few months, and the fabric wore thinner than a bargain bin sofa. The dashboard creaked if you looked at it too hard. And like cheap furniture, many interior pieces simply gave up and fell off. People would pull on the glove box handle and end up with the entire door in their lap. Build quality was so inconsistent that two identical Omegas could behave like different species. One car might develop carburetor issues, while the one next to it sounded like a toolbox rolling downstairs. Panel gaps varied from slightly crooked to did a drunk person assemble this? Wind whistles were common at highway speeds, making long-distance travel an irritating symphony of rattles, squeaks, and the occasional mysterious thump. Performance? Calling it performance is generous. The base engine, GM's overworked 250 inline-six, was durable but hopelessly weak when combined with the Omega's choking emissions equipment. Acceleration was so sluggish that merging onto highways felt like a trust exercise between you and oncoming traffic. Step on the gas, and the engine groaned like it was being asked to do something unreasonable. The optional 350 V8 helped, but even then, it delivered its power like a tired old man climbing stairs, slowly, reluctantly, and with much complaint. Handling was not a strong point either. The Omega rode on a suspension that felt like it was tuned by someone who only heard rumors of what good handling might be. The steering was vague, the brakes were mushy, and the body leaned dramatically through turns. With enough speed, you could make the car tilt like it was trying to wave at pedestrians. It wasn't unsafe exactly, just unsettling, and a little seasick-inducing. Add to this the Omega's susceptibility to rust. In northern states, these cars disintegrated faster than winter road salt could touch them. Fenders bubbled, rocker panels dissolved, and floor pans rotted through. Many Omegas died not from mechanical failure, but from corrosion so severe that inspections became impossible to pass. In theory, the Omega was meant to give Oldsmobile buyers a small, affordable option with a premium look. In practice, it delivered the worst of both worlds: the cheapness of a base model Nova, combined with the expectations of Oldsmobile buyers who really wanted quality. Even GM insiders knew the X-Body had problems, but cost-cutting and production pressure made it impossible to fix them. By the time the Omega was a few years old, it had already built a reputation for being unreliable, cheaply built, and frustrating to own. It wasn't rare, it wasn't special, and it definitely wasn't the refined compact Oldsmobile advertised. It was simply another example of 1970s Detroit corner cutting. A car that tried very hard to pretend it wasn't something it wasn't, and fooled almost no one.
Number 8. The 1970 Chevrolet Nova 4-cylinder version. When people think of the Chevrolet Nova, they often imagine a scrappy little muscle car, lightweight, nimble, and capable of hosting anything from a small block V8 to a fire-breathing big block. The Nova earned its reputation by being simple, affordable, and easily upgraded, especially during the golden years of late 1960s muscle. So it's almost ironic that one of the rarest configurations ever offered, yet also one of the most disappointing, was the 1970 Chevrolet Nova equipped with a 4-cylinder engine. Designed as a fuel-saving, budget-friendly variant, this version of the Nova ended up becoming a symbol of GM's failed attempts to read the American market. The 4-cylinder Nova didn't just fall short of expectations, it was practically born to lose. By 1970, the American automotive landscape was still roaring with horsepower addiction. Fuel was cheap, insurance wasn't yet strangling performance cars, and even economy models typically offered 6 cylinders at minimum. GM, however, believed there was an emerging market for ultra-efficient compact cars, competing with imports like Volkswagen and the increasingly popular Japanese small cars. So Chevrolet made a bold move: install a 4-cylinder engine into the Nova, a platform that had been designed around larger, heavier, and more powerful engines. It sounded logical on paper: offer a cheaper, simpler version of a successful car. But someone at GM forgot one crucial detail. The Nova was not designed to be a lightweight economy car. It was still a 3,000-pound American sedan. The 4-cylinder engine used in the 1970 Nova was the 153 cubic inch, 2.5-liter inline-4. Originally introduced in earlier years, it was essentially half of Chevy's 230 CI inline-6, chopped down for simplicity and cost savings. While robust and durable in theory, it had a fatal flaw. It produced very little horsepower. With barely 90 horsepower, the engine struggled to move the Nova's steel-heavy body with any semblance of confidence. Acceleration tests were embarrassing. Highway merging required prayer. Passing maneuvers were a gamble. The car didn't just feel slow, it felt exhausted. Owners frequently complained that the engine seemed to strain under even normal city driving. Vibrations traveled through the steering column, dashboard, and floor. The car shook, it rattled, and it frequently reminded drivers that it desperately wanted too much cylinders. a driving experience filled with noise and regret. Where the six-cylinder and V8 Novas offered smooth torque and decent drivability, the four-cylinder Nova felt unrefined and overwhelmed. The engine produced a harsh mechanical clatter at higher RPMs, and drivers quickly learned that the car demanded constant throttle to keep up with traffic. At idle, the vibrations made the steering wheel tremble. At low speeds, the car felt lumpy and hesitant. At higher speeds, the engine sounded like it might jump out of the engine bay in protest. The suspension was still tuned for heavier engines, resulting in odd handling dynamics. It rode stiff in some areas and mushy in others. Steering feel suffered as well, making the entire experience feel mismatched, like driving a car that had been assembled from leftover parts from different models. GM's mistake wasn't offering a four-cylinder engine. Their mistake was offering this four-cylinder engine in a car as heavy and substantial as the Nova. American buyers of 1970 were not seeking bare-bones economy cars yet. They wanted small cars that still felt powerful and comfortable. GM underestimated the importance of performance, even in the compact category. Meanwhile, the imports they hoped to compete with, Volkswagen Beetle, Datsun 510, Toyota Corona, were lighter, more efficient, and engineered specifically for small displacement engines. In comparison, the Nova four-cylinder felt primitive, sluggish, and uninspired. Dealers couldn't give them away. Many customers bought the six-cylinder version, which offered vastly better performance for only a small price increase. The result? Very few four-cylinder Novas were sold. A rare model, but rare does not mean desirable. Today, the 1970 Nova remains a popular collector car, but almost exclusively in its V8 or six-cylinder configurations. The four-cylinder version is technically rare, but for the same reason some diseases are rare. Nobody wanted it. Collectors tend to avoid it because the engine is painfully underpowered, it offers no performance appeal, most enthusiasts prefer V8 swaps. Many survivors were scrapped decades ago. It exists today mostly as a footnote, an example of what happens when automakers chase a market unprepared for their ideas. The 1970 Chevrolet Nova four-cylinder isn't remembered fondly, but it's remembered honestly. It serves as a reminder that performance matters even in compact cars. GM's attempt to turn the Nova into a bargain basement fuel miser resulted in one of the weakest offerings in the model's history. It was a car that fought against its design, a machine that shook, rattled, and begged for mercy under the weight of its mission. It wasn't a bad car at its core, just a car given the wrong heart. In a decade where horsepower still ruled and Americans wanted style and speed, the four-cylinder Nova simply didn't stand a chance. It was born underpowered, misunderstood, and ultimately forgotten. And in the end, it became exactly what people said it was: a Nova that cried for horsepower.
Number 7. The 1978 Ford Fairmont Futura. When Ford introduced the Fairmont for 1978, its mission was simple: replace the aging Ford Maverick with a modern, practical, fuel-efficient compact. It was designed to be bland, affordable, sensible, and anonymous, like a rolling beige cardigan with wheels. And that was fine. The late 1970s were a troubled time for the American auto industry, and customers were growing increasingly interested in economy vehicles rather than performance. But then Ford did something puzzling. They decided this car, the humble, modest, economy-minded Fairmont, needed a sporty variant. Enter the 1978 Ford Fairmont Futura, a car that wore a flashy fastback roofline and stepped-up styling, yet retained all the performance excitement of a sleeping house cat. The Futura was a marketing move, not a real performance model. It was the automotive equivalent of putting racing stripes on a riding lawnmower. Ford sold the image of sportiness without delivering any of the substance. When the Fairmont arrived, Ford wanted to cover as many market niches as possible. The base sedan was for penny pinchers, the wagon was for families, and the Futura?
It was supposed to appeal to younger buyers, people who, in Ford's imagination, wanted a hint of Thunderbird flair without the Thunderbird price tag. So Ford took the basic Fairmont body and gave it a unique slanted B-pillar and wrap-over roof treatment. On the outside, this fastback style design actually looked decent. It gave the car some visual identity and made it stand out from the otherwise square, boxy Fairmont line. But underneath, the Futura still rode on the exact same suspension, weight, powertrains, and engineering as the standard Fairmont. Calling it sporty was generous. Calling it exciting was delusional. Ford engineers did the bare minimum. They didn't stiffen the suspension, they didn't retune the steering, they didn't rework the chassis, they didn't even offer meaningful performance upgrades. What the Futura got instead was a unique roofline, two-tone paint options, a slightly fancier interior trim, marginally nicer wheel covers. That was it. It was like Ford said, "Here, we put some eyeliner on it. Now it's sporty." Customers who saw the swoopy roof expected a car that drove differently. What they got was the same Fairmont sedan, just harder to see out of. If the styling promised sportiness, the engine selection absolutely crushed that dream. The 1978 Futura offered a gutless 2.3-liter inline-4, a lethargic 200 CI inline-6, and the only semi-respectable option, the 308 V8, which in 1978 was emission-strangled and producing numbers that would embarrass a modern subcompact. Even with the V8, the Futura couldn't outrun much of anything. 0 to 60 times wandered into double-digit territory, and the car felt slow, breathless, and bored with itself. With the four-cylinder, drivers felt like they were in a long-term negotiation with gravity. The Futura may have looked like it was ready to run, but under the hood, it had the heart of a base-model economy appliance. If the styling didn't spoil the sporty illusion, the handling certainly did. The Fairmont used the Ford Fox platform, which had potential. Later on, this very same platform would be the basis for the Ford Mustang, proving it could support real performance when properly engineered. But in 1978, the Fairmont was tuned for one thing: cheap comfort. The result? Numb, vague steering that felt disconnected from the road, body lean that resembled a canoe entering a sharp turn, soft suspension that floated, dipped, and wandered, tires that squealed with terror during even mild cornering. Driving the Futura fast felt like challenging a lazy moose to a dance-off. The car responded slowly, reluctantly, and with zero precision. If the road curved sharply, the Futura reacted like it needed a motivational speech first. There was nothing sporty about how this car moved. Ford imagined the Futura would attract young drivers, but young drivers in 1978 were not fooled. They wanted actual performance cars. Trans Ams, Camaros, Mustangs, or at least something with grunt and attitude. The Futura had neither. It ended up being purchased mostly by people who liked the roofline, older buyers who wanted something mildly stylish, bargain hunters. Ford aimed for sporty excitement and ended up hitting Grandma's Sunday car with a haircut. Several reasons made the 1978 Ford Fairmont Futura a misfire. Number 1, sporty appearance, zero sporty engineering. People expected more than just a slanted roof. Number 2, engines that didn't match the look. A sports model needs performance. The Futura delivered boredom. Number 3, handling that was far from athletic. It was built for comfort and cheapness, not agility. Number 4, a market that wasn't buying the illusion. Late 1970s drivers were cynical. They knew a poser when they saw one. Ironically, the Futura's greatest achievement was not being a sporty car, it was simply being part of the Fox body legacy. The platform it sat on would go on to support the Mustang GT, the Capri, and other genuinely exciting cars. But the 1978 Futura itself? It remains a curiosity, a car famous not for brilliance, but for its absurd attempt to look like something it wasn't. Today, the Futura is remembered as a mildly attractive but thoroughly unimpressive coupe, proof that styling cannot replace engineering, an example of 1970s automotive marketing at its most optimistic. Collectors sometimes seek them out for nostalgia or to use as Mustang-based project cars, but nobody claims it was truly sporty. Even Ford never pretended again. In the final analysis, the 1978 Ford Fairmont Futura was the automotive equivalent of a plain sandwich wearing a leather jacket. It tried to look bold, daring, and youthful, but beneath the surface, it was still the same mild-mannered, economical Fairmont. The roofline was flashy, the marketing was enthusiastic, but the car itself, it drove like it was designed by a government committee, it handled like a distracted moose, and it accelerated like it needed a moment to think about it. The Futura wasn't sporty. It just dressed up like it was.
Number 6. The 1976 Chrysler New Yorker Brougham. The 1976 Chrysler New Yorker Brougham stands today as one of the most exaggerated, overbuilt, overstuffed luxury cars ever unleashed on American roads. At nearly 19 feet long and weighing well over 2 tons, this car wasn't just big, it was prehistoric. A rolling relic of a time when American automakers believed luxury meant adding more of everything. More chrome, more length, more padding, more plushness, and, unfortunately, more fuel consumption than any sane driver could justify. It wasn't a car. It was a living room with a steering wheel, a soft, floating lounge chair on wheels that treated handling as an afterthought and fuel efficiency as a myth. In many ways, the 1976 New Yorker Brougham was the last gasp of the mega luxury land yacht era, an automotive philosophy that would soon be crushed by rising fuel prices, stricter emission standards, and the simple reality that Americans were tired of driving ships. But in 1976, Chrysler doubled down. The New Yorker Brougham was enormous, decadent, out of touch, and unapologetically excessive. And that is exactly what makes it unforgettable. A car that needed its own postal code. To understand the insanity of the 1976 New Yorker Brougham, you have to start with its size. This car was so long that owners joked about needing a telescope to see the hood ornament from the driver's seat. At nearly 19 feet, it was longer than some pickup trucks, longer than many modern SUVs, and longer than the parking spaces it was forced to squeeze into during grocery trips. The front overhang alone was large enough to cast a shadow across a driveway. Parallel parking it required instinct, prayer, and a willingness to accept body damage. Tight turns were theoretical. U-turns were heroic. And navigating a city street felt like trying to maneuver a freight train through a shopping mall. Chrysler built the New Yorker Brougham not for winding roads or urban driving, but for the open highway, where its size at least seemed appropriate. And even there, the car wandered like a drunk cow. Handling like a sinking ship. The New Yorker Brougham floated on Chrysler's torsion bar front suspension and leaf spring rear, tuned for the softest possible ride. This meant the driver felt insulated from every bump, ripple, and pebble on the road, which sounds wonderful until you hit a corner. Then the problems begin. The car leaned so dramatically that passengers instinctively grabbed door handles. The steering wheel required constant correction. It felt like there was a full second of delay between turning the wheel and the car acknowledging your request. Body roll was not just present, it was enthusiastic. The comparison to a sinking ship is an exaggeration. It's accuracy. The New Yorker didn't turn. It tilted, like it was trying to remember how physics worked. Driving spiritedly was impossible. Even driving precisely was a challenge. Owners didn't steer the New Yorker. They suggested a direction and hoped for the best. Fuel economy that made owners cry. Then there was the fuel economy, if you could call it that. The 1976 New Yorker Brougham came with Chrysler's massive 440 cubic inch V8, an engine famous for torque, smoothness, and miserable efficiency. This was an engine designed for an era before oil crises, before EPA mileage numbers, and before the phrase fuel efficient meant anything to Chrysler engineers. Real-world fuel economy was often 7 to 9 mpgs in the city, 10 to 12 mpgs on the highway if you behaved, 5 mpgs if the weather was cold, the engine was tired, or traffic was heavy. And premium fuel was often recommended. Owning this car meant budgeting more for gasoline than groceries. The fuel gauge moved faster than the speedometer. Some owners reported watching the needle drop in real time when accelerating onto a freeway. Opening the wallet for gas station visits wasn't just unpleasant, it was emotionally damaging. You didn't fill up the New Yorker. You donated money to it like a ritual sacrifice.
luxury in the most overloaded way possible. Despite these flaws, the 1976 New Yorker Brougham delivered luxury the only way 1970s Chrysler knew it, with overwhelming, smothering abundance. Inside the car was a padded sanctuary. The seats were so soft and deep that passengers often sunk several inches before finding a stable position. Upholstery materials ranged from velour to brocade to leather, each more ornate than necessary. The dashboard was wide, flat, and covered in acres of simulated wood. Standard and optional features included power seats, power windows, power locks, automatic climate control, a Cartier clock, more chrome than a kitchen appliance store. It was ostentatious, elegant in an outdated way, and absolutely comfortable. If you didn't care about fuel economy or handling, and many buyers didn't, the New Yorker was one of the most relaxing cars on the road. End of the age of land yachts. By 1976, the writing was already on the wall for land yachts. Fuel economy standards were tightening, emissions regulations were strangling engines, consumers were growing weary of enormous cars that couldn't fit into normal parking spaces. The New Yorker Brougham was the wrong car at the wrong time, a symbol of Chrysler's refusal to acknowledge the changing world. It was big when buyers wanted small. It was thirsty when drivers wanted efficient. It was flashy when the public wanted practicality. Within just a few years, Chrysler would shrink its flagship models dramatically. The age of near 20-foot sedans was over. But the 1976 New Yorker Brougham remains a perfect time capsule of American automotive excess before the downsizing revolution hit. Despite everything, its size, its thirst, its soggy handling, the New Yorker Brougham is still fondly remembered, not because it was good, but because it was unforgettable. It represented the last stand of true American land yachts, a philosophy of comfort above all else, and a design era that prioritized presence over practicality. Today, collectors admire these cars not for performance or efficiency, but because they embody an extinct species of automobile, the kind that will never return. In the end, the 1976 Chrysler New Yorker Brougham was the automotive equivalent of a giant padded recliner. Unbelievably comfortable, wildly impractical, and hilariously out of proportion with reality. It handled like a sinking ship, drank fuel like it had a hole in the tank, and dominated the road with sheer mass rather than engineering finesse. But at the same time, it was spectacular, ridiculous, and uniquely American. It was a car that didn't care what anyone thought. It existed to float, to lounge, and to impress your neighbors. And in that sense, it fulfilled its mission perfectly.
Number 5. The 1983 Dodge Murata Slant 6. Few cars captured the absurd contradictions of early 1980s American automotive engineering quite like the 1983 Dodge Murata with the Slant 6 engine. It was marketed as a personal luxury coupe, sleek, stylish, comfortable, and ready to compete with the Thunderbird, Regal, and Monte Carlo. But under the hood, Dodge stuffed an engine that had no business being in a so-called premium coupe, the ancient industrial-grade 225 Slant 6. This was an engine designed for plumbers' vans, mail trucks, and taxicabs. Its durability was legendary. Its smoothness was decent. Its performance? Wheezy at best, humiliating at worst. Putting the Slant 6 into the Murata created one of the most unbalanced and unintentionally comedic cars of the decade. A vehicle trying desperately to be classy while powered by something that sounded like it came out of an airport maintenance cart. On the outside, the Murata wasn't actually a bad-looking car. It had clean proportions, formal lines, a long hood, and a squared-off roofline that fit right in with early 1980s personal luxury styling. The upscale trim levels were plastered with vinyl tops, chrome strips, padded roof panels, and opera windows. Everything Chrysler thought upper-middle-class buyers wanted. But none of that mattered the moment you turned the key. The Slant 6 fired up with a coarse agricultural grumble that completely shattered the illusion of refinement. While competitors offered smooth V6s and powerful V8s, the Murata sounded like a municipal water pump, a late-night taxi idling behind a diner, or a tired delivery van warming up for a long shift. Luxury cars are supposed to purr.
The Murata coughed, rattled, and cleared its throat like a chain-smoking uncle. The 225 Slant 6 was never meant for speed. It was meant for reliability, running forever at low RPM, carrying heavy loads, and surviving abuse from fleet drivers who didn't know what maintenance was. In the Murata, however, it created performance numbers that were downright embarrassing for a coupe trying to compete in a semi-premium market. 0 to 60 mile/hour times averaged 16 to 18 seconds, if you were lucky, if the wind was behind you, and if the road sloped slightly downhill. Merging onto highways required planning normally associated with military operations. Passing maneuvers were theoretical. Hills were personal enemies. With the air conditioning on, acceleration decreased even further. Some owners joked that turning the AC on felt like dragging an anchor. The Murata wasn't just slow, it was publicly, visibly slow, in a class of cars that Americans expected to be quick, confident, and stylish. The Slant 6 brought a kind of rugged durability completely at odds with the Murata's intended identity. This engine was famous for running forever, surviving abuse, performing well in harsh fleet service, powering work vans and delivery wagons. None of this translated into excitement or exclusivity. Instead, the Murata felt like a taxi cab in formal wear, a work truck pretending to be a sports coupe, a blue-collar engine forced into white-collar clothing. Dodge wanted the Murata to feel like a personal luxury statement. Instead, it felt like a fleet vehicle that accidentally wandered into a showroom full of Cadillacs and Lincolns. Interior luxury that couldn't hide the mechanical reality. Inside, the Murata tried. Really, it did. It came with plush velour seating, padded dashboards, fake wood trim, digital clock, soft carpet, optional leather. It looked fine, comfortable even. But once the car started moving, the fantasy collapsed. The Slant 6 vibrated lightly at idle and groaned loudly under acceleration. The 3-speed torque-flight transmission shifted slowly and reluctantly, as if dreading the idea of forcing the engine to work harder. Drivers often described the experience as comfortable misery. The ride was soft, the seats were couch-like, but the engine made every movement feel labored, like the car was dragging a dead elephant behind it. A victim of Chrysler's desperation. By 1983, Chrysler was struggling for survival. Budgets were tight, resources were limited, and engineering priorities were chaotic. The Murata suffered because it was built during a transitional era. The company was moving toward front-wheel drive K cars, V8s had been neutered by emissions rules, and fuel economy regulations were squeezing big coupes out of the market. So Chrysler threw together what they could: an aging mid-size platform, a body that looked luxury enough, and an engine that was cheaper to install than a proper V8. The result was a car that felt like a compromise, not a vision. Production numbers tell the story clearly. The Murata never sold well, but the Slant 6 version was especially unwanted. Buyers who wanted luxury and style bought Monte Carlos, Regals, and Thunderbirds. Buyers who wanted economy didn't want a giant rear-wheel drive coupe. Buyers who wanted performance wouldn't be caught dead in a Slant 6 Murata. The car occupied a strange, awkward middle ground that appealed to almost nobody. Even Dodge dealers struggled to explain who the Murata was for. By the end of its run, the model was quietly discontinued, barely remembered even by Dodge fans. Today, rare not because it's valuable, but because it was unwanted. Surviving Murata Slant 6 cars are rare today, but not in the collectible, desirable way. They're rare because almost nobody wanted to keep them. Many were scrapped, abandoned, or used as cheap beaters until they died. Collectors prefer V8 Muratas or the rare models with the sporty CMX package. The Slant 6 versions are usually seen as oddities, conversation pieces, or obscure examples of Chrysler's darkest days. The 1983 Dodge Murata Slant 6 remains one of the most ironic cars of its era. A luxury coupe powered by a taxi engine, a stylish body with no performance, a comfortable interior overshadowed by painfully slow acceleration. It tried to be elegant, it tried to be refined, but in the end, it was a wheezy, underpowered, deeply confused automobile. A perfect symbol of early 1980s Chrysler mismanagement. And that's exactly why it's unforgettable.
Number 4. The 1980 Plymouth Sapporo. The automotive world is full of cars that failed because they were poorly engineered, badly designed, or built cheaply. But the 1980 Plymouth Sapporo is a different kind of failure.
one created almost entirely by circumstance and corporate interference. It began life as the Mitsubishi Galant Lambda, a sleek and fairly well-respected sporty GT coupe from Japan. When sold under Mitsubishi's badge overseas, the car had performance, smooth engines, and stylish late 70s looks. Then, Chrysler got involved. And suddenly, the Sapporo became a slow, choked, and prematurely outdated coupe. A perfect example of the way American emission systems of the era could wreck even a competent design. A Japanese GT with promise before Chrysler got to it. In Japan and in Europe, the original Mitsubishi Galant Lambda actually had a decent reputation. It was known for being smooth, comfortable, stylish, moderately sporty, well-built. Its engine lineup included sprightly fours and even a capable 2.6-liter unit that gave the car respectable acceleration for its time. It wasn't the pure sports machine, but it was a sharp personal coupe, something that could compete with the Toyota Celica, Mazda Cosmo, or Nissan Silvia. Then, Chrysler decided to rebadge it for America as the Plymouth Sapporo and as the Dodge Challenger, not to be confused with the real muscle car. To meet U.S. regulations, Chrysler added layers of emissions equipment that turned the lively Mitsubishi power plant into something that felt asthmatic and exhausted. This is the point where everything went downhill. The late 1970s and early 1980s were a catastrophic era for emissions engineering. Instead of modern catalytic converters and computer-controlled fuel injection, automakers were still using crude methods: miles of vacuum hoses, air pumps, primitive carburetors, EGR systems that worked only sometimes, choked exhaust routing, retarded timing, lean burn calibrations that made engines stumble and die. The results? Engines that ran hotter, rougher, slower, and far less reliably. For the Sapporo, Chrysler's emissions additions robbed the powertrain of nearly all its vigor. Acceleration times stretched into embarrassing territory. Throttle response became sluggish and unpredictable. Highway merging required a prayer and half a mile of open space. It looked sporty, but its power delivery felt like it was inhaling through a clogged paper straw. Gutless acceleration that ruined the driving experience. On paper, the Sapporo tried to sell itself as a personal luxury sport coupe. It had bucket seats, sweeping body lines, alloy wheels, and an interior that looked futuristic for the time. On the road, it was a study of disappointment. The Americanized 2.6-liter engine produced numbers that were downright pitiful for its size, barely enough to trouble economy cars of the period. It delivered its power awkwardly with a flat mid-range and a whiny top end that offered more noise than movement. Drivers often complained that the car hesitated when cold, the carburetor bogged under load, the emissions equipment caused random surges in stalls, acceleration felt like pulling a sled uphill. In a decade when buyers were beginning to expect at least some performance from Japanese imports, the Sapporo felt hopelessly behind. The Sapporo arrived in 1980 with design cues that fell ahead of the curve in 1977, but embarrassingly outdated by the early 80s. It wore angular wedge proportions, a long straight beltline, big chrome bumpers, boxy window frames, a tall upright greenhouse. This styling worked briefly during the late Malaise era, and then died overnight when aerodynamic modern designs took over. The moment cars like the 1982 Pontiac Firebird, 1983 Honda Prelude, and 1984 Nissan 300ZX hit the market, the Sapporo looked like last decade's fashion disaster. Oversized collars, polyester suits, and shag carpeting. What was once futuristic suddenly looked like something from an old catalog nobody wanted anymore. Even the interior aged poorly. The square gauges, wood-toned plastics, and chrome toggle trim looked dated just a few years later. The Sapporo went from modern GT to grandpa's forgotten coupe in record time. The fatal flaw of the 1980 Sapporo was its inability to choose an identity. It wasn't fast enough to be sporty, refined enough to be luxurious, efficient enough to be economical, stylish enough to be aspirational. The car existed in a marketing no man's land. Buyers who wanted a sporty coupe chose a Celica or Prelude. Buyers who wanted luxury chose a Thunderbird or Riviera. Buyers who wanted dependable Japanese engineering bought a Datsun 200SX or a Toyota Corona. The Sapporo tried to be everything and ended up being nothing. A victim of Chrysler's desperation and Mitsubishi's limitations. Chrysler was financially collapsing at the time, relying heavily on Mitsubishi imports to fill showroom gaps. The Sapporo wasn't chosen because it was exceptional, it was chosen because Chrysler needed anything to sell. Unfortunately, the car was stuck in the worst moment of the emissions era, saddled with outdated carburation and additional smog equipment that Mitsubishi's engine was never designed to handle. The result was an underpowered, inefficient, and frustrating driver experience. Worse, Pontiac, Ford, and GM were starting to introduce electronic engine controls, while Japanese competitors were refining fuel injection systems. The Sapporo got neither. It hit the market at the exact moment its technology became obsolete. Like many forgotten Chrysler-Mitsubishi collaborations, the Sapporo is rare today. But it's not rare because collectors cherish it. It's rare because rust killed many, the engines were strangled by emissions gear, parts became difficult to source, and owners didn't feel the cars were worth saving. Survivors exist mostly as curiosities, cars people see at shows and say, "Oh yeah, I forgot Plymouth sold that." It's the automotive equivalent of a dusty VHS tape found in a thrift store, interesting as a relic, but not because it's valuable. The 1980 Plymouth Sapporo is a perfect example of how a decent car can become mediocre through mismanagement and regulation. Mitsubishi gave Chrysler a competent GT coupe. Chrysler gave it worse performance, uglier styling longevity, clunky emission systems, and a confused identity. What could have been a stylish import success turned into a forgettable, underpowered relic that aged faster than anyone expected. It wasn't the worst car of the 1980s, but it was one of the most disappointing. A car that promised more than it ever delivered, and a reminder of how badly Chrysler struggled during its darkest years.
Number 3. 1991 Chevrolet Caprice 4.3-liter V6, when GM tried to power a battleship with a lawnmower. The 1991 Chevrolet Caprice should have been a confident return to form for GM's full-size sedans. It launched with a bold, jelly bean-like redesign, a slippery shape meant to drag the old B-body into the aerodynamic age. But one decision ruined everything. GM decided to offer a 4.3-liter V6 as the base engine for a car that weighed nearly 4,000 pounds before you even added people, luggage, or that box of tools every Caprice owner carried just in case. The result was a car so underpowered, so painfully mismatched to its own mass, that even police departments, famous for buying Caprices in bulk, rejected the V6 model like it was infected. The problem wasn't that the 4.3 V6 was inherently terrible. In the right setting, it was fine. In a Chevy Astra van or an S10 pickup, the engine delivered decent torque and reasonable reliability. But in a full-size sedan, one that was nearly the size of a small yacht and built like a rolling living room, the V6 had no chance. GM essentially took an engine intended for delivery vans and grocery getters and dropped it into a car that demanded far more grunt. The result was sluggish acceleration that bordered on comedy. 0 to 60 took long enough for drivers to question their life choices, and merging onto highways required planning, prayer, and a generous downhill slope. Pressing the accelerator produced a groaning mechanical protest, a sound halfway between an overworked lawnmower and a tired industrial fan. This was supposed to be a full-size American sedan, the type that once roared with big block fury. Instead, the V6 Caprice spidered its way forward like a reluctant appliance. Even when floored, the engine responded with the enthusiasm of a teenager forced to wake up at 6 a.m. Nothing about the driving experience felt appropriate for a car of its stature. The throttle had the urgency of damp cardboard, and passing maneuvers kept patience, space, and the acceptance that you were not going to look cool while doing it.
Owners quickly realized the V6 wasn't just slow, it was miserably slow, especially when paired with the early 1990s GM overdrive transmission, which seemed confused about whether it wanted to shift, hold gears, or contemplate retirement. The gearbox frequently hunted around under light throttle, trying to hide the fact that it had nothing to work with. Put the pedal down, and it downshifted abruptly, the V6 screaming in protest, as the car reluctantly gathered speed. The whole experience felt like pushing a refrigerator up a hill with a hairdryer. Fuel economy wasn't even significantly better than the V8 versions, adding insult to injury. Owners who bought the V6 thinking they'd save money on gas discovered that hauling nearly 2 tons with a small engine actually made efficiency worse. The car had to work harder, rev higher, and strain constantly just to complete normal driving tasks. Meanwhile, the far superior 5.0 and 5.7 V8s loafed along effortlessly, often achieving equal or better mileage because they weren't being tortured. Then there was the issue of image. The Caprice was supposed to be a symbol of American abundance, big, soft, comfortable, and powerful. Putting a V6 in it was like mounting bicycle pedals inside a cruise ship. The car looked imposing, but when it came time to move, all that visual swagger evaporated. This mismatch between appearance and performance confused buyers. Some assumed the V6 model must be a rare special edition because there were so few on the road. The truth was far less glamorous. Most of them died young, and the few survivors are artifacts of GM's most misguided moment. Proof that you can't make a land yacht move by installing a lawn equipment engine under the hood. The V6 Caprice is now called a forgotten Caprice because nobody wanted to admit they bought one. Enthusiasts avoid it, collectors ignore it, even junkyards treat surviving V6 Caprices like unwanted leftovers. The engine is usually pulled and tossed aside so the shell can become a derby car. In the end, the 1991 Caprice 4.3 V6 is a perfect example of GM's early 1990s confusion, a company trying to modernize while cutting corners in the worst possible places. The V6 wasn't just a bad fit, it was a fundamental misunderstanding of what buyers expected from a full-size American sedan. A Caprice was supposed to glide with authority, not wheeze like a portable generator.
Number 2. 1989 Ford Festiva. Reliable? Yes. Enjoyable? Absolutely not. The 1989 Ford Festiva is one of those strange automotive contradictions. A car that earned a reputation for reliability, durability, and low running costs, yet almost nobody who drove one would ever claim to have enjoyed the experience. It wasn't a bad car in the sense of exploding engines or catastrophic failures. Instead, the Festiva represented a different kind of misery, the slow, grinding, joyless kind that came from driving a vehicle so minimalist, so stripped of comfort and refinement, that it felt like Ford was daring people to see how little they could tolerate in the name of saving money. On paper, the Festiva made perfect sense. Designed by Mazda, built by Kia, and sold by Ford, it was a global effort aimed at producing the cheapest possible new car that wasn't actively dangerous or defective. Its small 1.3-liter four-cylinder had the mechanical honesty of a sewing machine. Reliable, simple, and easy to fix. The car weighed barely over 1,700 pounds, which meant the engine didn't have to work that hard around town. In city driving, the Festiva felt alert and willing enough, buzzing along with the enthusiasm of a budget commuter that knew its purpose. You could neglect maintenance, miss oil changes, abuse the clutch, and still the Festiva would stubbornly keep going. In terms of basic utility, it was a winner. But that's where the compliments end. The moment you closed the door, assuming you didn't slam it too hard, the illusion of modern carness evaporated. The doors sounded like someone dropping a spoon into an empty soda can. The sheet metal was so thin that leaning against the bodywork felt risky, as if you might leave a dent with your elbow. Ford clearly economized everywhere, especially inside the cabin. The interior plastics were hard, rattly, and seemed designed more for durability than any sense of comfort. The dashboard was a smooth slab of cheapness, broken only by switches that clicked and clacked like toys. Sound insulation was nearly non-existent. Every pebble, every gust of wind, every tire vibration and every cough from the exhaust came into the cabin with full enthusiasm. At city speeds, these flaws were tolerable. But take the Festiva onto the highway, and the experience transformed into an ordeal. The little 1.3 engine had to rev its heart out just to maintain 65 miles per hour, buzzing loudly enough to drown out conversation, music, and even your own thoughts. The engine didn't hum, it screamed. It sounded like it was begging for mercy, while simultaneously threatening to leap out of the engine bay in protest. Long-distance driving became a test of mental endurance. You didn't just drive a Festiva on the highway, you survived it. High winds? A nightmare. The car was so light that a strong gust could shove it sideways like a napkin caught in a draft. Passing semi-trucks created shockwaves that bounced the Festiva around its lane, forcing drivers to grip the steering wheel with both hands and pray the suspension, tires, and God were all on the same side that day. Steering feel was vague and twitchy, further adding to the sense that the car didn't so much track straight as it did wander in the general direction you wanted to go. Handling wasn't much better. The Festiva's narrow tires and softly sprung suspension made cornering a careful, tentative affair. There was body roll, wheel hop, and a level of understeer that seemed baked into the car's DNA. It wasn't dangerous, but it wasn't confidence-inspiring either. It drove exactly like what it was: the cheapest new car you could buy in America in the late 1980s. And yet, despite all this misery, the Festiva endured. It was precisely its simplicity that made it durable. With no complex electronics, no expensive materials, and no real refinement to break, the Festiva became a kind of cockroach of the automotive world. Unglamorous, stubborn, and nearly impossible to kill. College students, minimum wage workers, rural families, delivery drivers, and anyone who needed absolute bare-bones transportation bought these things because they were new, inexpensive, and dependable. They didn't pretend to be stylish, they didn't pretend to be powerful, they didn't pretend to be anything except transportation. But being reliable doesn't mean being good. And the 1989 Ford Festiva proved that reliability can coexist with misery as long as the manufacturer is willing to strip away every comfort and refinement. The Festiva was honest in its awfulness. It never lied about what it was. It simply offered mobility at the lowest cost and dared buyers to complain about anything beyond that. Today, surviving Festivas are sometimes treated with nostalgic affection. People admire their simplicity. Some even collect them ironically, but few would ever argue that driving one was enjoyable. The Festiva belonged to a different era, a time when cheap really meant cheap, when subcompact cars were lightweight penalty boxes instead of well-equipped miniature commuters. In the end, the 1989 Ford Festiva stands as a reminder of what automakers once offered to budget-conscious buyers: a car that was mechanically faithful, yet emotionally draining. It did its job, and it did it reliably. But it made sure you felt every penny you saved, every bump, every gust of wind, every screaming mile on the highway, reminding you that reliability and comfort are not the same thing.
Number 1. 1974 Lincoln Mark IV. Luxury that moved like a cargo ship. The 1974 Lincoln Mark IV occupies a strange and fascinating niche in American automotive history. It is a car that is instantly recognizable, dripping with personal luxury cues: towering vertical grille, opulent Lando vinyl roof, long flowing body lines, and interior trim that looked like it was plugged from a stately drawing room. It epitomized the personal luxury coupe era of the 1970s, a time when Americans loved cars that were massive, glitzy, and symbolic of success. Yet for all its style and presence, the Mark IV had a fundamental problem. It couldn't move, at least not with any enthusiasm. The base engine, a 460 cubic inch V8, was a giant lump of torque and displacement, yes, but it was severely detuned.
Emissions controls, insurance regulations, and fuel economy concerns had transformed what should have been a smooth and potent powerhouse into a sluggish, bloated machine that accelerated slower than a UPS truck on a steep hill. Driving a base-engine Mark IV was an exercise in patience. Merging onto highways required careful planning, and passing slower traffic demanded not just pressing the accelerator, but waiting for physics itself to acquiesce. The car's enormous weight, nearly 5,000 pounds fully loaded, combined with soft suspension and a long wheelbase, meant that inertia was the car's defining trait. Every start from a stop felt like nudging a barge off a dock. Every turn or lane change required a commitment. There was no instant reaction, only a slow, ponderous compliance as tires and suspension obeyed with deliberate lethargy. Yet paradoxically, these flaws were not universally complained about at the time. The Mark IV's buyers weren't seeking cornering prowess, racetrack lap times, or tight handling. They wanted presence, status, and the feeling of driving a mobile living room. From that perspective, the Mark IV delivered spectacularly. The cabin was vast, the seats thick and plush, the dashboard a masterclass in late 70s American automotive opulence. Vinyl, leather, wood grain trim, and brushed chrome adorned nearly every surface. The ride was soft, floating over bumps like a yacht on calm water. Noise insulation for its era was impressive. At city speeds, one could glide along with conversations easily audible, barely aware of road or engine sounds. But the Mark IV's luxury came at a cost. The engine, though nominally large, was hampered by emissions controls and low compression ratios. The carburetor and ignition were tuned to prioritize smooth idling and legal exhaust levels over performance. Consequently, the car felt underpowered for its size, its acceleration measured in groans and creaks rather than excitement. Fuel economy was dismal, even for the period, adding another layer of practical frustration. Owners might have paid for a car that exuded wealth and taste, only to discover that filling the enormous gas tank became a frequent, expensive necessity. The driving dynamics were equally compromised by the Mark IV's sheer mass. Steering was heavy and imprecise at low speeds, and the long wheelbase combined with soft, thick suspension gave the sensation of steering a floating sofa. Emergency maneuvers were sluggish and disconcerting. The car would obediently respond eventually, but never quickly or confidently. On the highway, the soft suspension and lofty ride height could produce a gentle rocking motion over uneven pavement, further reminding the driver that this was not a sports coupe. It was a moving lounge chair with a trunk. Interestingly, despite these shortcomings, the Mark IV became an icon of the personal luxury coupe era. Its style and presence overshadowed the mechanical realities. People saw the towering hood ornament, the sculpted Landau roof, and the opulent interior, and assumed competence and power were implied. The car became a symbol of 1970s American excess, oversized, glitzy, indulgent, and utterly impractical. The Mark IV also serves as a historical snapshot. It illustrates the tension between style and substance, a recurring theme in the automotive malaise era. Automakers were pressured by emissions regulations, insurance concerns, and fuel crises to detune engines, soften suspensions, and add weight-saving compromises that contradicted performance. Luxury styling cues and impressive dimensions were emphasized over acceleration or handling, leading to a generation of cars that looked incredible but drove slowly and ponderously. The Mark IV epitomized this conflict, a car that could turn heads and command respect, but could not impress anyone behind the wheel in terms of actual driving performance. In modern standards, the base engine Mark IV is amusing. Its acceleration is laughably slow compared to anything even mildly sporty today. Merging on highways can feel like a trial of patience. Steering and handling are sluggish. Yet in its own era, the Mark IV succeeded in doing exactly what it was designed to do: to provide a visible, tactile sense of wealth and status, and to let occupants float along in comfort, seemingly above the world outside. In conclusion, the 1974 Lincoln Mark IV is a study in contradictions. Massive, stylish, and luxurious, yet slow, underpowered, and ponderous. It perfectly embodies the era of personal luxury coupes, an American obsession with presence over performance. While driving it was an exercise in patience and acceptance, owning it allowed the driver to revel in style, comfort, and authority. The Mark IV reminds us that sometimes a car's purpose isn't about speed or handling, it's about how it makes you feel, even if it moves slower than a delivery truck.